On the afternoon of February the 1st, 1948, they cremated the murdered Mahatma Gandhi. Three years earlier, Indians in the Far East had mourned the violent death of another revered leader, Subhas Chandra Bose. The Mahatma and Netaji, India's Holy Father and her lost Führer. This is not Gandhi's story, which is secure in history and Hollywood. It's the story of nearly 40,000 Indians who rejected non-violence and declared war on Britain. Their symbol, not Gandhi's spinning wheel, but a springing tiger. Britain and India like to believe that independence was achieved by moral force and imperial magnanimity. These men don't fit that comfortable view. The soldiers of the Indian National Army were censored out of news dispatches when alive and, like Trotsky, painted out of the picture when dead. 40 years on, some of the British officials who in the name of the King Emperor had to deal with this odd mix of treachery and nationalism look back at their secret war. Looking back too, surviving officers of the Indian National Army, Bose's chief lieutenants and devotees, men who fought a war of sorts for India's independence. Pre-war India, 400 million people under British rule. For a century there had been talk of self-government when the natives are sufficiently improved. But Independence Day was always tomorrow. Today was long, and it belonged to the Raj. After the First World War, when Indians fought for their imperial rulers in the expectation that loyalty would be rewarded, Gandhi took over the Congress movement. Among his early followers was Subhas Chandra Bose, studying at Cambridge for the Indian Civil Service, which recruited bright young Indians to help govern their country for the British. When Gandhi called for a boycott of British institutions, Bose renounced a comfortable career to join the revolution. His revolution began quietly enough. He won election to the Calcutta Corporation, but was soon suspected of links with terrorist movements. So the British provided him with the vital credentials of a future nationalist leader, periodic trips to the King Emperor's jails. At the 1928 All India Congress in Calcutta, Bose was the hero of the militant left, already impatient with Gandhi's softly tactics. Lakshmi Swaminathan was a young observer at the Congress.
We got to Calcutta about 5 days before the Congress session was to start, and there we heard that Subhash Chandra Bose was in charge of the volunteers for the Congress session, and that he was parading them every morning and giving them some kind of a sort of a military training, not with arms, mind you, but training them like soldiers are, to march and to salute and things like that. We found that as far as the older generation, that was my mother and her friend, they were all very much against this training that Subhash Chandra Bose was bringing in, and they thought that he was bringing in an element of which would probably lead to violence later.
Gandhi laughed off the volunteers as Bertram Mill's circus. But if Bose, frozen at attention in his high leather boots, looked a clown to the old guard, he seemed to the young a man of destiny, their reassurance that Indians didn't have to turn the other cheek. Bose paid lip service to Gandhi's non-violence, but he was unmoved by the heroism and self-sacrifice of this novel form of struggle. Non-violent resistance was good for propaganda. It might win over a few wets in the imperial camp. But freedom, he said, would never be won without a clash of arms. One day, self-respecting Indians would fight back against the whiteskins and the Indians who did their dirty work for them. Nirad Chowdhury worked with Congress leaders and recalls Subhash Chandra Bose's attitude to non-violence.
Contempt, as all we Bengalis of the gentleman class of the Bengali gentry had. Bengali gentry of the upper classes had a very militaristic attitude. It was largely acquired in the 19th century, but of course derived from the previous social antecedents in which they maintained their rights, largely by violence, but betrayed by their retainers. Here are my tenants who are showing signs of insubordination. I'll send my armed retainers and bring them down, bring them to heel. And this attitude in the Bengali gentry was always there. And Subhash Bose came from that class.
In the agitation surrounding Gandhi's symbolic salt march, Bose was arrested again. He was now leader of the militant tendency within Congress and critical of Gandhi's conservative reliance on big business. Gandhi, he said, was an old, useless piece of furniture. Then in 1932 he fell ill. The British released him from jail on condition he left India for treatment and, they hoped, a long convalescence. He was away for the best part of 5 years, a respite for the Raj and for Gandhi. Bose used his European exile to canvass support for India among Britain's enemies. He was feted in Mussolini's Italy. He met De Valera in Dublin and paid homage to the 1916 rebels who had made England's difficulty Ireland's opportunity. But most of his time was spent in Hitler's Germany, winning friends and influencing Nazis against the British. If he saw a distinction between his own socialism and Hitler's National Socialism, he kept it to himself. Back in India, violent pressures for constitutional reform were beginning to give way to political action. By 1937, Gandhi's followers controlled elected Congress governments in 8 out of 11 provinces of British India. Then, in a bold attempt to co-opt the militants, Gandhi invited Bose to take over as Congress president. In 1938, he made his comeback, now formal head of the world's most powerful independence movement.
Give him a chance. That was the idea in Mahatma Gandhi's mind. And he deserved the supreme official position in the nationalist movement. An idea of doing justice to him rather than any kind of certainty that he would be perfectly suited. Bose, I would be inclined to say, had no political skill whatever. He was a patriotic, extremist leader, popular demagogic leader.
The honeymoon with Gandhi was short. Convinced that war was on the way, Bose met German delegations in secret and publicly praised Nazi labor conscription, a model, he said, for India. When Bose sought to extend his presidency for a second year, Gandhi threw his prestige behind a rival candidate, and the scene was set for a decisive trial of strength. In one corner, the wily old saint who had renounced politics the better to control politicians. In the other, the disciple of Marx and Mussolini who preached that power came out of the barrel of a gun. To the world's astonishment, Congress preferred the militant to the mystic, and Bose won his second term. The defeated Mahatma responded with unholy ruthlessness. Those who deserted Bose, he suggested, would be serving India more loyally than those who backed him. The blackmail worked, and the Congress Working Committee resigned en masse. A president without an executive, Bose again fell seriously ill. Gandhi sent his love and proposed he resign on health grounds. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, Bose left the leadership to form his own faction, Forward Bloc, pro-Soviet and pro-German, for these were the days of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Then he waited for war. The war with Germany split India. Newsreels showed recruits pouring into the Indian army, but the Congress was outraged. Why should Indians join Britain's crusade for freedom when Britain denied them independence? Bose quoted an old Hindu proverb, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." When Britain and her allies suffered early setbacks, many Indians openly rejoiced.
I was going to Sharat Bose's house when I saw people jumping down and snatching newspapers from the newsboys, in which they attack on Holland, bombing of Rotterdam. They went on dancing wildly as if it was a wild with joy, like the pop singers. They were so glad. And the whole humiliation came as a windfall in the way of emotional satisfaction to the Indian people. And the amount of gloating over success of the German, I mean misery or the sufferings of both France and others, it's horrible to relate.
Police agents took notes at Bose's meetings, and he was arrested again. In jail, he now made the most momentous decision of his life, to leave India and fight alongside Britain's enemies. In an ironically Gandhian gesture, he went on hunger strike to get out of jail. The Raj could do without martyrs, and after 6 days of fasting, he was allowed home. His young nephew, Shishir Bose, was asked to help smuggle him out of India through Afghanistan.
I drove him out of the house, dressed as an Indian Muslim gentleman, an insurance man by profession. And after 2 nights of driving, took him to a rail station called Gomo in the neighboring state of Bihar, from where he took the train to the northwest frontier.
The tale of his great escape gave Bose a lasting reputation for courage and daring do. But the records show that the cloak and dagger operation was probably unnecessary. No one was really concerned to keep Bose in India. There was no police watch on his house, and when the British legation discovered his presence in Kabul, no attempt was made to hold him. But Bose didn't know that, nor did he know that one of his closest aides was to be a secret agent for the Russians, the Germans, and later the British. Today, the house from which the Great Escape began is a museum and a shrine. Even the car in which he was smuggled out of Calcutta is on show to the faithful. From Afghanistan, Bose completed his journey to Germany. India too needed a dictatorship, he told the Nazis. There was no doubt who he had in mind as India's Führer. He found his shock troops in Germany's prisoner of war camps. Thousands of Indians had been captured in North Africa. Bose toured the camps and recruited an Indian legion, promising it would one day fight for India. He was joined by Abid Hassan, a young Indian student living in Germany.
When I was called to Berlin one day, I told Mr. Bose, saying, "Sir, that we have got a national greeting." He said, "What is it? What is it?" So I said, "Hello." He was furious. He said, "Hassan, I don't like cheap humor." But he said, "The idea is good. We must have a national greeting. You better all think over it." So I thought of Jai Hind. And I tried it with a couple of friends of mine. They liked it. So I went back to Berlin and told Mr. Bose. He immediately called everyone and said, "You better try it out." So everyone was saying, Jai Hind, victory to India, victory to India." They liked it.
The Germans made stirring propaganda films of the Indian Legion in training. The Legion called Bose Netaji, the leader, but he was leader in name only. His recruits had to swear allegiance to Hitler, who personally turned down the idea of an Indian government in exile. But Bose remained loyal to his Nazi hosts.
Germany was at war with Great Britain. That was enough for him. And then, in spite of his military posturing, he had not the slightest military flair, any knowledge of military realities or possibilities in warfare. He did not have anything at all. He was all about strutting about, drilling and that sort of thing. He fanatically believed that Germany would win. So he went over. He should have realized that Germany would make use of him only as a tool.
Accompanied by his German secretary Emily Schenkel, Bose called on Mussolini, who tried to recruit her to spy on his Indian guest. A bad idea, since Bose was soon to marry her, concealing the relationship as Hitler concealed his with Eva Braun. His true bride, he told his followers, was India. Back with his legion, Bose began to seem irrelevant. The tide of war was beginning to turn against Hitler. Jai Hind, victory to India, sounded hollow in the mouths of a puppet army. Yet British India was in mortal danger, not from the west, but the east. The Japanese, sweeping through Malaya and Burma, seemed poised to pluck the brightest jewel from Britain's imperial crown. Their slogan, Asia for the Asians. And Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose was 5,000 miles away, in the wrong place, at the wrong time.
Public television.
Opportunity to find out what Peggy Ashcroft is really
When
like.
putting it politely, what farmers use on fields for helping crops. For the Jap and the Wab and the Hun, they'll be sorry for the war that they begun. They must pay the price, those three blind lies, the Jap and the Wab and the Hun.
In 1942, the Japanese overrun British Malaya and Burma. Soon to be nicknamed Hirohito Zone, the 1st Battalion 14th Punjab Regiment of the Indian Army was overrun by Japanese tanks. A small party was cut off in the jungle, including Captain Mohan Singh.
I had seen quite a good number of my old colleagues and comrades dying and disappearing forever just in a few seconds. I myself had stood on a thin line, very thin line indeed, which divides life from death, and I was surprised to find myself still alive. So I thought it's given me a fresh lease of life, and I decided to use it for a better purpose.
Mohan Singh's better purpose was to change sides. He accepted a Japanese invitation to raise an Indian National Army like Bose's Legion in Germany. Hugh Toy was a major in Indian Army intelligence.
The reaction, I think, of us all was shock, outrage, disbelief. We knew these soldiers, we'd led them, we'd been, as used to be said, their father and their mother for years, for a very long time, and it was incredible that after that relationship, they should apparently have joined the other side. the Japanese had a reputation for killing their prisoners. I was thinking the other day that if I had been in that situation, rather than fall into Japanese hands, I would have contemplated suicide, as many British officers in Malaya did. And this must have been a factor in Mohan Singh's mind too.
In February, the Japanese launched their attack on Singapore. On February the 15th, Britain surrendered its impregnable fortress. The Japanese had 100,000 prisoners, of whom 60,000 were Indians. They were handed over to Mohan Singh, first commander of the Indian National Army.
And then I gave a very fiery speech, and I blamed the British for their defeat. I said they have let you down, and they threw you against a superior enemy without any tank or air support, just as gun fodder. They have betrayed you, and your real enemy is the British, and British enemies must be our friends. Their difficulty should be our opportunity. It was a lengthy speech, and then I gave them a brief history, how I approached the Japanese, and they have promised me full support to liberate my country, and I appealed to them to join the Indian National Army, which I was raising.
Fighting with the Japanese meant fighting and killing Indians who had been your own comrades in arms. How did you prepare your men for this?
Well, I started publicity campaign, intensive brainwashing. Many drama parties were raised, many singing parties were raised, and daily lectures. Half of my time was spent in doing the brainwashing, so that even if our father stops us, we should be prepared to shoot him. Any leader who undertakes such a task must be an orator of hatred also. And I was inciting them, provoking them, mentally goading them, emotionally, to the extent that British were our enemy number one. Whosoever sides with them should be treated as such.
Many Indians chose life in Japanese prison camps rather than change sides. But thousands followed their officers into Mohan Singh's army and placed their trust in their captors.
It was a big risk. It was a leap in the dark. I thought my action would help the Japanese also to some extent. And in a way, if I put it bluntly, I was trying to exploit them in the interest of my country. They were trying to exploit me in the interest of their country. And I had to take that risk.
The risk didn't come off. Mohan Singh grew disillusioned with the Japanese and their methods.
At one stage, some Japanese officer approached me that for your training, they are prepared to give me a few Britishers to use them in bayonet training, etc., as dummies. I was horrified. I said I would much rather dissolve the army than to do such silly things.
Mohan Singh disbanded the INA and was arrested by the Japanese. His men looked for a new leader, the Japanese for a new puppet. Back in Berlin, Hitler gave Bose an engraved cigarette case and permission to leave. A submarine was laid on for the long, dangerous journey to Japan, traveling with him his private secretary, Abid Hassan.
Even at the time when we entered our most dangerous part of the journey, that was between Scotland and Iceland. That was the one area through which all the German U-boats passed. And the British were depth charging it regularly, from morning till night, whole day, because knowing that it was going. And we hear dum, dum. Sometimes, the submarine shook. Then one day, a strange thing happened. Our boat sighted a British tanker and wanted to fire it. And we did succeed in it. And the whole sea was ablaze with flames. And happy with it, the captain, after a couple of days, saw one of those freighters, and wanted to torpedo it. But by some mistake, before we could fire the torpedo, our submarine came up on the surface. And the British freighter immediately took action, turned nearly 90 degrees round, and with full force came to ramp us. And the submarine is a very frail thing, hardly a few, and a little shock would happen. But having come surface by mistake, they couldn't dive immediately. And the captain was shouting in one of the filters, down, get down, dive, dive, dive. And all was heard over the internal telecommunication, and my heart was beating furiously. And then I hear, Hassan, I have dictated that line twice to you. You have not even taken it once.
In Japan's new empire, Bose was given a welcome recalling his heyday in Congress and installed before the newsreel cameras as leader of the 2 million Indians in Japanese-occupied territory.
India and Japan have in the past been bound by deep cultural ties which are about 20 centuries old. In recent times, these cultural relations have been interrupted because of the British domination of India.
A provisional government of Free India was proclaimed, with Bose as head of state, prime minister, foreign secretary, and supreme military commander, and the Japanese as overlords. The INA itself was rebuilt, with regiments named after Gandhi and Nehru. Prisoners who had refused to serve under Mohan Singh and had suffered for it were pressed to think again. Bose also recruited Indian civilians, and not only men.
And one of the points that he raised was that he would have a women's regiment. And of course, I welcomed it very much and said this was a wonderful idea. He said, yes, you see, and they'll be put into trousers and given to it. I said, trousers? Are women wearing trousers? I said, sir, that's impossible. You'll never get them out of the saris. He said, you do not know the Indian women as I do. You just wait and see their reaction.
So we went to the INA headquarters, and we found one sympathetic army officer who offered to let us have 3 men to train us. So from the very next afternoon we started, and for about 72 hours we practiced. And we could do everything but get that click when presenting the arms. And the instructor said, till you get that, I'm not going to let you present arms to Netaji because it'll be a disgrace on me. Oh, the Japanese were very much against the idea. And they put all sorts of obstacles in our way. And then they said, well, we are not going to waste any of our ammunition and things like that on them. So Netaji told them, well, you don't have to supply us with anything. I've already started a campaign to collect funds, and funds are pouring in. We shall buy everything that we need, and we'll be responsible for their training, and we'll be responsible for everything about them. So it's no business or concern of yours.
Japan's concern was India. The strategy was to capture Imphal across the northeast frontier and sweep on into the continent. Japanese Field Marshal Terauchi put the plan to Bose and to his divisional commander, Shah Nawaz.
Then Netaji asked him, what is the role of the INA? Where is the INA? You have shown me all the Japanese forces. Where are the INA? Well, he said, we won't use the INA now because the INA are trained on British methods of attack. They cannot bear the same hardships as Japanese troops can. Our methods are different. and we will first defeat the British, and after we enter India, then only we will use the INA. Netaji then turned around and said, no, this does not suit us, and I insist that the Indian National Army should take part in the fighting.
Some 6,000 INA men were moved up to the front, but the Japanese never trusted them to act independently. A newsreel film of the INA in action was doctored for propaganda purposes. Making his own propaganda, Supreme Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten rallied Allied troops against Japs and Jifs, the Japanese-inspired fifth column of the INA.
Somebody started the story that the Jap was a kind of jungle Superman. I can assure you that he's nothing of the sort. He's an unintelligent slum dweller with nothing worth fighting for except a fanatical belief that his emperor is a kind of god. When the Jap tries his old trick of getting behind you and cutting your lines of communication, stay put. We'll supply you by air, and you'll defeat him. From now on, there'll be no more retreat.
But the INA's 1st Brigade did establish a patrol base on Indian soil.
And when we crossed the Indian border and hoisted the tricolor for the first time on our soil of our motherland, there was a great jubilation. And people prostrated themselves and kissed the soil of our motherland, that we were back again on the sacred soil of our motherland. There was a great jubilation and a feeling of great patriotism.
It was a short-lived liberation as General Slim's 14th Army and the monsoons cut Japanese supply lines. It was the turning point of the war. Soon Japanese and INA were in disorderly retreat through Burma.
Conditions were most terrible. By the time we started our retreat, rains had set in. All the roads were washed away. There was no transport of any sort, and any person who was sick or injured could not be provided with any transport. They walked or they just sat down and died. All the rivers were swollen, full of water, flooded, no means of crossing the rivers. There was continuous rain, knee-deep slush, and almost on every step of that human being bloated, millions and millions of flies and dead bodies full of maggots. So the conditions are very, very terrible.
You were being pursued, of course, by the very army which you had once fought in.
Well, at that time, we were on different sides. We were fighting for India's liberation, and the army, the British Indian Army, was advancing. Of course, there were with some close relatives. My real brother was also fighting for the British, and my cousins, I knew they were opposite me, and they were. But at that time, we were out to fight, and it was people who were fighting for India's freedom and people who were fighting for the British.
Napoleon is supposed to say that an army marches on its stomach, But I personally think from my experience and army marches on the support they can get from the doctors and medicine. Now, we were walking and we knew, all of us, that we prayed that if a bullet hits us, that it should hit us in the head or in the heart, not in the leg. And because that was one of the most depressing and experience that I ever had in my life, was to leave our dead unburied. We had to just leave them. And worse than that, those who were wounded were also to be left alone, to the mercy of God and to whatever happened.
53,000 Japanese were lost on the flight through Burma. Of the 6,000 INA men who had hoped to liberate India from the British, only 600 returned in one piece. 2,000 were injured, 1,500 surrendered or deserted, 400 were killed in battle, and 1,500 died of disease and starvation. For Southeast Asia Command, victory lay on the road to Mandalay, in the heart of Burma. The Japanese assigned a point on the river Irrawaddy, south of Mandalay, to a strong formation of the INA. But Slim's forces crossed virtually unopposed, and the scene was set for a pitched battle. But unlike the Japanese, the INA offered only token resistance. Whole detachments surrendered without firing a shot, and the southern approach to Mandalay lay unprotected. As Mandalay fell, General Slim Riley described the INA surrender as the chief contribution they made to either side in the Burma War. Among the former Indian Army officers who had changed sides was Captain Prem Saigal, now commanding the 2nd INA Infantry.
The position was very difficult. We had been retreating across the jungles, and finally we came to a place where the river Aravadi and the road met together, and there was no escape route at all. So we decided to take up a defensive position around a village which was mainly inhabited by Indians. Next day, we were attacked. Aeroplanes came and started bombing the village. Even then we were continuing to fight, but the villagers came to us. They said, it's all very well to fight, for you to fight here, but we are the people who are going to get killed, and you had no business to just sacrifice our lives just because you want to continue fighting. That had a tremendous impact on not only me, but my other officers and men, and therefore we decided that the best thing under the circumstances would be to surrender.
Even before Saigal's surrender, Bose was told that 5 staff officers had deserted back to the British. He ordered the observance of a Traitors' Day. Effigies of the 5 were to be made in human or animal form, and every member of the camp was to give full vent to his disgust and hatred. Let your slogan, he wrote, be blood, blood, and blood.
At that time, every hope of his had vanished. So he clung to his illusion. But I now feel strongly that only sensible course for him would have been either gather some of the very devoted and brave followers and die fighting in Burma, or surrender to the British. surrender to the British.
Why did he cling so long to this illusion?
Meant complete total failure of his life. Everything he has hoped for, everything he reckoned on. You must not forget again one thing, the terrible capacity of all of us Indians, particularly Bengalis, to cling to an illusion when everything shows that it is an illusion.
3 days after Japan's defeat, Bose boarded a plane with the apparent intention of seeking Soviet backing for the INA's lost cause. It was to be his last flight. Lieutenant Colonel John Figgis interrogated one of Bose's captured aides.
The aircraft, he said, had just started to take off from Taipei airport when something exploded in the port engine. The aircraft crashed and it almost immediately burst into flames. The fuselage burst open. He explained that Bose was rather a stout man and therefore didn't move as easily as some. Also, apparently he was wearing a tight jacket which was engulfed in flames, and that meant that he was very badly burned.
Probably the only Indian politician who had the courage of his convictions died out of a mere folly, out of mere hatred of British rule which he had created within himself. This is the tragedy of Bose's life. And this immortalizes him as a tragic figure.
The war was over. Bose was dead, the INA apparently destroyed. The British held 25,000 INA prisoners. Principal advisor to India's Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal Auchinleck was Philip Mason.
We were quite certain about one thing, which was that one obviously couldn't contemplate the punishment by infliction of the death penalty on 20 or 30,000 people. It was quite out of the question.
We categorized them for security purposes as whites, greys, and blacks. Whites were people who were fit to go back to their units, their regiments, right away. Of course, they had a bit of leave first, naturally. Greys were people whom it was thought needed a certain amount of rehabilitation, time to get used to Indian Army conditions again, time to forget the propaganda they had absorbed, and after that would be fit to go back to their units. And mostly they did so at that time. The blacks were the people whom we thought were quite irreconcilable, who could not, whatever we did, be anything else but vehicles for enemy propaganda, and who therefore could not be allowed back in the Indian Army.
Major Toy was dispatched to Rangoon to interrogate the INA prisoners captured in Burma.
We had arrived there with, I think it was 8 bodies and 2 typewriters. That was absolutely all the equipment or support we had. It was clear we were going to have to go down to Singapore quite quickly, and the only way we could get any people to go with us was to go to the jail, sort out 10, I think it was, of the whitest INA we could quickly diagnose and take them with us. This was an extraordinary experience because the moment they were back in Indian Army uniform, you'd never think they'd been in the INA at all. They were just the splendid Indian other ranks that we had always known.
But INA leaders were brought to the Red Fort, Delhi, to face charges of treason. Auchinleck believed the Indian public would be sickened by well-publicized revelations of INA brutality against their own kith and kin.
Well, this was a mistake. When the Field Marshal Auchinleck was very keen that the first trial should be one of someone who had used brutality. He asked the Adjutant General about this, and the Adjutant General said, yes, the first man who's been chosen is a man who is guilty of extreme brutality. I asked if I could see the file, and I took it away with me and read it carefully. And there was no doubt about it. It was a case, if proved, of extreme brutality. This man had been commanding a battalion, and 2 men had been caught trying to escape, and he had ordered them to be tied up by their arms and swung from a tree and flogged to death.
But this case was delayed on a legal technicality. The 3 prisoners chosen instead for the first Red Fort trial had waged war on the King Emperor, but they had no record of brutality. They were badly chosen, and so was the venue of their trial.
Even at the time, I thought it was absolutely cretinous. The Red Fort had been the focus of the propaganda of the Indian National Army. The 3 men being tried, if you were to look at them, look at their records, were as decent a trio as you could possibly imagine, apart from the fact that they were in the INA.
Shah Nawaz, a Muslim, and Prem Saigal, a Hindu, were 2 of the first 3 to be tried.
We said that we were fighting for the freedom of our country, and the fight was taking place under a provisional government of Free India and by an organized army according to the rules of the international law. And therefore we are perfectly justified in doing so. Because if this fighting for one's freedom was a crime, to be treated as a crime, any country once enslaved would remain slave forever. America couldn't have become free. Yugoslavia couldn't have become free. Czechoslovakia couldn't have become free. Even England couldn't have got their freedom from the Roman Empire.
There were riots for the release of India's new national heroes, followed by mutinies in the police and the armed forces. Even Gandhi and Nehru clambered aboard the INA bandwagon, Gandhi visiting Bose's home to pay homage. Nehru put on the barrister's gown he hadn't worn for a quarter of a century and joined the INA defense lawyers.
In the case of Gandhi, even more than in the case of Nehru, it was opportunism, pure and simple. They had to obey the feeling in India over this matter.
The British bowed to Indian agitation, and the trials were first adjourned and then abandoned. Exemplary sentences were commuted, and INA members simply dismissed from the Indian Army, which they themselves had deserted in the first place. The trials helped revive a demoralized Congress, but compared with the Hindu-Muslim massacres over partition, they were little more than noises off. And when the rulers of the Raj did quit India in 1947, everyone claimed credit for the historically inevitable. The British had bungled the INA trials, but at least there was no replay of Dublin 1916. Nehru used the INA as a stepping stone to power, but banned its members from the new Indian Army. The INA itself turned out to be a military disaster, but in defeat it won a kind of victory, confirming the British in their conviction that at last it was time to wave India goodbye.
Honours, perhaps they were even all round. Bose was the villain of the piece, and he was dead. The INA, who had been so much influenced by him, mesmerized by him, were given the opportunity to state their case, and they had done so, to the applause of their countrymen. The Indian Army had made sure that treason would not be tolerated, either in the future or in the past. Perhaps, taking it all the way round, honours may have been even.
Nearly 40 years on, Mohan Singh is a Congress politician in the Punjab. Shah Nawaz became a minister in Mrs. Gandhi's government. Prem Saigal is a businessman in Kanpur. He married Lakshmi Swaminathan, who is now a hospital doctor and a communist trade union leader. Abid Hassan became India's ambassador to Denmark. He lives in Hyderabad with his niece, who sells cotton durries to Habitat. Subhash Chandra Bose still rivals Gandhi as the idol of millions of Indians. His portrait hangs in countless village homes. Many refuse to believe he is dead. Some predict his second coming in 1985 and the dawn of a new age of benevolent dictatorship. Nearly 40 years after the Raj, the ghosts of Netaji and the Mahatma are still wrestling for India's soul.
this be the year of Metagy, 1985? Fascinating documentary, story of the INA, called the Story of the Springing Tiger, the War of the Springing Tiger, and this part of our India night here on KQED. Coming up about 20 minutes from now.